Hey, Anchor community, I'm Pastor Susan, and I have the privilege of taking us into week 4 of our series, Unlikely, where we're looking at the work of God in the unlikely life of King David. We've seen how even though he's the youngest of his brothers, that he's the one that God chooses and anoints to be king. We've seen that he's an unlikely victor over the giant that he faced, Goliath, through the strength of God. We see that even though he was being attacked by Saul, that in an unlikely way, that as he took his circumstances to God, that God protected him. Because the truth is, when we look at a guy like David, who's unlikely, and we see the work of God in his life, that we can know and trust that God is at work in our unlikely lives today, and that gives us hope. You know, I remember years ago taking a class in the university where I was attending. It was called Sociology of the American Family. And it was one of those classes with a professor that was bent on busting up stereotypes that starry-eyed undergrads came in with as they left home for the first time. And one of the things was like, what are you looking for in a life partner? What are you looking for in a spouse? Let me tell you what the truth is. Here's what he would say. Guys, you're looking for a woman who is always encouraging, who's a great companion, who laughs at all of your jokes, and who has a clear line of thinking, is able to contribute to the bottom line, and is secure enough for you to go hang with your friends whenever you want to. Women, he would say, you ladies are looking for a guy who's going to pursue you, who's going to sweep you off your feet. He's going to be emotionally intelligent. He's able to be vulnerable and verbally expressive, and he's a buff athlete who's the life of a party, the corporate president, and he is able to be the alpha male in every situation. You're not going to find it, he would say. Those are unlikely combinations. You don't see strength and sensitivity in the same person. And if you expect to, you're going to be disappointed. And if you try to be that, you're going to fall short. But what this professor didn't tell us, and maybe he didn't know himself, was that the way of Jesus invites us not only to be strong in the strengths that we have, but also to be comfortable in the sensitivity that we have and to be able to be vulnerable in our relationships with God and with others. The way of Jesus is unlikely. David was unlikely in that he was strong. He had been a shepherd who was courageous. He had been a warrior who was mighty. He was Israel's greatest king. But David was also a person who pressed in on his sensitivity and was able from the bottom of his heart to express his intimate feelings in songs and in worship and in music to the Lord and before others. Sometimes we assume that men are the ones to be strong and women are the ones to be vulnerable. And the truth is that God's image is how we are made, and God has both strength and vulnerability, strength and sensitivity, and he's made us that way. He invites us to be comfortable in our sensitive aspects and in vulnerability. So what do we even mean? It's kind of vulnerable to talk about vulnerability, if I'm honest with you. Some of us are uncomfortable hearing about that and even thinking about that. If I want to run my 23-year-old out of the room, I'll talk about vulnerability, and that's the truth. But we're not just talking about, hey, we live in a world where there are hazards and risks around us. We're talking about being able to lower our guard and be emotionally vulnerable with another. When David fought Goliath, he took off Saul's armor, and he became vulnerable to attack by spears and javelins. But it wasn't that he was fearful of the weapons as much as he was trusting in the Lord. David took off the armor because he was vulnerable in relationship with God. It's a relational thing. Vulnerability is taking off the armor of our accomplishments and our accolades that keep us from feeling unloved. It's taking off the self-protection that keeps us from ever being hurt by another. It's taking off self-promotion that calms and hides our fears and insecurities. Vulnerability, one author would say, is the willingness to expose ourselves emotionally to another despite being afraid and despite the risks. Because vulnerability has relational risk. And yet the truth is that we can't have relationship without vulnerability. We can't be free to have the kind of relationship that God desires for us to have with him and with others without vulnerability. And the myth buster is that vulnerability doesn't trap us. It doesn't keep us confined. It doesn't oppress us or keep us under the control of another. It's just the opposite. And so we'll see in David's life that he was vulnerable, but he was free. So what was it in David's life? What did that look like for David to be vulnerable and free? We're going to be in 2 Samuel in chapter 6. We'll be starting with verse 14, but first I want to catch you up on where David is in his life since we've left off. He's defeated Goliath. He's been chased by King Saul. He's been driven away, and there's 10 years of civil war involving Saul and David over this time period. Finally, Saul has fallen in battle, and David has been made king. He's been put on the throne. And as he thinks about setting his kingdom in order, he's done a couple things. He's set up Jerusalem as the center of his reign, and he has a city of David within that city where he's going to have his reign. But he's also started saying, what do I need to be a good king of Israel? And priority one for him is to bring in something called the Ark of the Lord. The Ark of the Lord was a box, and it was wooden, and it was ornate, and it was made to very specific instructions that the Lord had given the people. It was covered with gold, and the lid on the box was the mercy seat. And this is where God's very presence would dwell as he met with the people. And so this is so significant because in this moment, as David finally takes the throne, he's saying, I want to bring in the presence of God into the city of Jerusalem so that as I lead, my leadership is before the presence of the Lord, and we can't miss that. So we're catching David as he enters the city of Jerusalem, and they're bringing in the Ark of the Lord. It is a big day. It is a big celebration, and it's been long in coming. Verse 14 of chapter 6. Wearing a linen ephod, David was dancing before the Lord with all his might, while he and all the Israelites were bringing up the ark of the Lord with shouts and with a sound of trumpets. As the ark of the Lord was entering the city of David, Michal, the daughter of Saul, watched from a window, and when she saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, she despised him in her heart. Well, the first thing we see in David's vulnerability is that David's vulnerability does not fit expectations. We can see clearly that it doesn't fit Michal's expectations. We all have unspoken expectations about vulnerability. It's uncomfortable. And some of us may think that if we're only strong enough, we can get a pass on needing to be vulnerable before others, not knowing that we miss out when we do. Some of us may think that vulnerability is for a season of extreme celebration or crisis and need, not knowing that when we miss out on that vulnerability, we're missing out on the deepest parts of what's available to us. David's vulnerability doesn't fit expectations. You know, as we think about what's it like to be King David in this moment? He's waited a good while to be king. He was anointed as a young boy, and he's waited a while to be king. And a king was an ornamented, revered figure. And people loved David, and he had favor. And so David would, on ordinary circumstances, he would wear an ornamented robe that was very expensive, that was dyed with rich colors that were very rare. And if I'm David, I can't wait for that day to happen. I've fought for a long time to get to the throne, and I can't wait for that day to come. You know, it reminds me of what it's like for you graduates who are wearing your cap and gown. You finally got it, and you're going to walk across that stage. It reminds me of being a bride who's ready to head down the aisle, and you have an ornamented gown that's elegant, and you can't wait for that day. It even reminds me of a kid like one of ours who had his first ever sports team uniform, and he wants to wear it to bed at night because he's so excited. David had waited, and he had the right to be king. He had credentials. He was a warrior. He was a courageous leader. He had won the favor of the people. He had the right. He was entitled to wear that robe of king. But what we see in this portion of scripture is that he wore a linen ephod, and he danced before the Lord with all his might. What does that mean that David takes off his kingly robe and he puts on a humble linen ephod? An ephod was a garment that a common priest would wear, not a high priest, but a common priest. It was probably sleeveless. It probably came down to his waist or below. It didn't leave him uncovered below, but it was something that priests would wear when they were serving God. Samuel, the prophet, when he was a little boy, would wear a linen ephod when he was serving in the house of God. So this is what David chooses to put on. And the significance here is that he is taking off his kingly robe as King David, and he's removing it and laying it aside so that he can honor and serve a greater king. David wants to make loud and clear to himself above all, but to others whom he's leading, that he will reign as a servant of the living God. It's unlikely. He also joins the common people. The passage says that all of Israel is bringing the ark of the Lord with shouts and sound of trumpets, and David's right in the middle of them. He's not driving in a fancy car, a convertible, and doing the wave. He is right there with them, and he is cutting loose on the dance floor. I think about wedding receptions I've been to where like the father of the bride cuts loose in dancing. And it's maybe the first time ever that the bride has ever seen her father dance. And it's sort of like, whoa, I don't know if this is awesome and fun or super embarrassing. Well, we see with Michal that it certainly wasn't awesome and fun. She was mortified. David's vulnerability did not fit Michal's expectations whatsoever. She'd expected to see a mighty warrior like the one who had fought for her hand in marriage. She'd expected to have a royal entry coming into the city that would make her proud. She'd expected that he would be a king who was dignified like King Saul, her father. And yet what Michal didn't realize in this moment is that David would never be a king like her father, King Saul. David, even as he fought Goliath and he removed the armor because he couldn't be free to move and trust in the Lord for his protection, that David would never wear the armor of King Saul. He wouldn't wear his armor of accomplishments and accolades. David wasn't looking for approval from the people. He wouldn't look for the armor of self-protection. He wasn't trying to defend himself against the accusations even of Michal, his wife. He wouldn't wear the armor of self-promotion, trying to advance himself in the eyes of his people, men and women. David would allow himself to be vulnerable, and it was unexpected. I think about our oldest as he applied to colleges, and we knew that just based on who he was, he had a decent chance to get into some pretty prestigious schools. It was kind of exciting. I didn't actually think this out loud to myself, but I did kind of have a thought like, oh, wouldn't it be cool to put some of those prestigious school window decals in my rear window of my car, or to, tell people that Michael got into such and such a school. So we trusted God with that decision for Michael. And as Michael made that decision, it was between an East Coast Ivy League school whose name you would know worldwide, and a small school in Spokane that probably most people have never heard of. And he landed here, and it was unexpected. And I had to, even as a parent, just kind of like step back and wonder, like, what armor was I trying to wear? Was I trying to wear an armor of accomplishment and accolade that was coming through my son? And I also recognize that I believe that Michael, in his wisdom at that time, was saying, I don't want to put on armor that makes it harder for me to be vulnerable. Because what he saw was like the people that he wanted to be like were the people that were coming out of here. I want to be like that, vulnerable and free before the Lord. It was unexpected, and it cost him. Teachers would come up to him excited that they'd heard that he'd got into this school or that. And you could see their faces kind of be a little disappointed when it didn't turn out the way that they'd hoped, because they had armor that they wanted accomplishments and accolades in too. It's interesting, vulnerability has a cost. And sometimes that cost is that when we entrust someone else with our vulnerability, that it's not safeguarded, it's not safe, and it leads to pain and confusion. But without vulnerability, we don't have the chance to be free. We can't be free to love others and to be with God in the way that he's intended us to be. And it's actually in those very moments of pain or of confusion that God's invitation is the most present. If we actually pause and listen, we might hear that invitation to come closer, that he's here. What he wants to do is to set us free. And so we find that in David's life, that freedom is actually the result of vulnerability. True freedom starts with vulnerability. We're going to look at the life of David and Michal in contrasting ways that they engaged vulnerability. Because God invites us to vulnerability, and he wants to set us free, but there are two different outcomes that we see in this passage. Join me in reading verse 20 through 22. When David returned home to bless his household, this is after all the celebration, Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet him, and she said, "How the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, going around half naked in full view of the slave girls, of the servants, as any vulgar fellow would." David said to Michal, "It was before the Lord who chose me rather than your father or anyone from his house when he appointed me ruler over the Lord's people Israel. I will celebrate before the Lord. I will become even more undignified than this, and I will be humiliated in my own eyes. But by these slave girls you spoke of, I will be held in honor." And Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no children to the day of her death. Let's look at the way of David. Remember, he has been in a linen ephod. He's been like going crazy on the dance floor. He's celebrating. He's dancing in the streets. He's got people all around him. He hasn't distinguished himself. He's taken off his robe. He is in full form in the celebration of the presence of God in his life coming into Jerusalem. But the important thing for us to see here is this is not a show. This is for no one else in the room, on the streets, but between David and his God. This was not going to be posted on TikTok. This was not Dancing with the Stars. This was David being vulnerable before God in a way that took everyone aback. Where did David get that kind of vulnerability? Where did he have the audacity to be that vulnerable before the Lord and before others? Well, David's vulnerability came from intimacy with God. Vulnerability and intimacy, they are closely intermingled. You can't have intimacy without vulnerability. And as you are more vulnerable, you get more intimate. And it's this beautiful relationship that David had discovered since his youth. Filled with the Spirit of God as he was a boy and anointed by Samuel, he had spent his young life in a literal wilderness, shepherding sheep in a vulnerable environment. He had trusted in God as he fought against Goliath. He had a track record. This is a way of life for him to engage with his needs, to engage with his celebration with the Lord, to be intimate with him. I want you to imagine and even see a photo of the Judean wilderness where David would have shepherded. Because in our own minds, we've been in a metaphorical wilderness, right? David was in a real wilderness. And so I want us to get a picture of what his intimacy with God looked like. In this photo, you'll see dry desert barrenness. And here are the words that David would say in those moments of his life when he's alone, when he's vulnerable to outside influences, to weather, to predators, to thieves. When he's in the heat of the day, these are the words that David would say. "The Lord is my shepherd. I have everything I need. He makes me lie down in green pastures." I don't see green pastures in this photo. He leads me beside still waters. There aren't the lakes that I would imagine as I first read this psalm. He restores my soul. David knew that God could restore his soul even in the wasteland of the desert of the Judean wilderness. He leads me along right paths for his name's sake. There aren't clearly marked trails here. David had learned to trust in the Lord as he shepherded in the wilderness of Judea. God was with him. Psalm 63, he would say this, "You, God, are my God. Earnestly I seek you. I thirst for you." Can you see why? "My whole being longs for you in a dry and parched land where there is no water." Amen, David. We see it with you. Thank you for pouring out your heart in a way that brings intimacy and vulnerability. David was vulnerable with God, and when he had that vulnerability and that intimacy with God, he had no fear of being vulnerable and intimate with other people. When you're vulnerable with God, it overflows into vulnerability with others, and that's what we see in the life of David. He was intimate with God in the wilderness. He was intimate with God in his life. Let's take a look at the way of Michal. Michal has a different story. We're reading in verse 16. "As the ark of the Lord was entering the city of David, Michal, the daughter of Saul, watched from a window. And when she saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, she despised him in her heart." Man, this is a chilly passage. It is icy cold. We see that she's from a distance. She's not even down there with him and with the people. What's going on? She's called the daughter of Saul instead of David's wife. He's called King David instead of her husband. There is some ice in this relationship, and we want to know more. She despised him. She hated him from the very center of her being. Something deep has gone on in her life. When David returned home, in verse 20, we're looking now. When David returned home to bless his household, Michal, daughter of Saul, came out to meet him and said, "How the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, going around half naked in full view of the slave girls of his servants, as any vulgar fellow would." Michal couldn't even wait for him to come home and tell her how his day was, and the biggest day probably of his life. She met him on the driveway, and she had toxic, venomous words for him. And we see here that David himself isn't perfect. He has a jab for Michal in this conversation. It's nice to know that we're all still learning here. We're not holding up David as the perfect example. He's not. But he is a man whose intimacy has been shaped and formed by God, so we can learn from him. The bigger question for me is what happened to Michal? Something's gone on in the life of Michal that caused her to be so bitter toward David. And the answer comes with 1 Samuel chapter 18, whereas in no other place in all of Scripture, there are 3 words: Michal loved David. One writer says that where you scratch a cynic, you'll find a disappointed romantic. Michal had such a backlog of disappointments in her lives, and they began even well before she had met David. Kurt Thompson, a psychiatrist, author, speaker, says this, that 80% of the emotional conflict between couples is rooted in events that predate the couple even knowing each other. Michal had a backlog of disappointments. With a father like Saul, she had grown up having jealousy and poor character modeled for her. He used her and manipulated her in his dealings with David, giving her in marriage in a manipulative scheme. And then as she risked her life to help David escape Saul, he left and was gone, maybe for years. Scripture doesn't tell us, but we know that there's no account of him circling back with her. She had to have some deep wounds. Not only that, David took other wives. She was his first, and she loved him. She had made herself vulnerable to David, and that wasn't reciprocated in the way that she'd imagined. David took her away from a husband that she had been given, a second husband that she'd been given by her father, and it turns out that it was probably politically motivated. Can you see the hurt that Michal had? Don't we have a heart for her? We come in with a judgmental attitude, but then just like us, she has a story. Hurt turns into bitterness. Hebrews chapter 12:15 says this, "Keep a sharp eye out for weeds of bitter discontent. A thistle or two gone to seed can ruin a whole garden in no time." We see that Michal's vulnerability had turned to bitterness. while David's had turned to freedom. But even in Michal's bitterness, there's still hope. God is the one who can take a heart of stone in Michal and make it into a heart of flesh, a heart that can love again. He can heal deep wounds. He can set captives free. And so we're thankful that we serve a God that can offer hope even to a person like Michal. God asks us to be vulnerable with him so that we can be vulnerable with others and so that we can have intimate relationship with him. And that relationship that we have with him brings relational healing. What does it look like to be vulnerable to God and to allow him to do the deeper work of healing in you? We all have stories. I have my own. I've sat with many of you who have entrusted me with your stories. And here's the thing that I find with vulnerability that I just want us to take away today is that the sweetness of the freedom that God is inviting you to far exceeds the pain of being vulnerable to allow him to get that for you. The sweetness of the freedom exceeds the pain of the process. It's hard to allow yourself to revisit pain. It's hard to be open to examining yourself. But can we start that conversation? Would you invite someone in who is safe for you to begin that conversation with? Maybe sit down with a counselor, with someone who can help you through that process. Can you take the courageous step to open your heart to God, who sees you and knows you and wants you to know that you're seen and known and loved? Because once you have that freedom, you will have overflow of your freedom to others, because true freedom is contagious. We're going to read in verse 17. They brought the ark of the Lord and set it in the place inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And David sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings before the Lord. After he had finished sacrificing the burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord Almighty. Then he gave a loaf of bread, a cake of dates, and a cake of raisins to each person in the whole crowd of Israelites, both men and women. And all the people went to their homes. David is king, and he's brought in the presence of God, and the presence of God is never neutral. What's happened in the life of David is that his freedom has begun to overflow. And as he takes his place as the priestly king wearing the linen ephod, he uses his authority to bless others in the highest name under heaven and on earth. One of the beautiful pieces of this is that he's inclusive. Every person in the crowd, both men and women. And this is said in a society where women were still considered property. He wanted to bless everyone. Isn't that reflective of the heart of God? He wants all people to come to him, every tribe, every skin color, every tongue, every nation, every socioeconomic status. He wants to have in his fold. He wants to bless each one of those. And that reflects the promise of ages ago when he said, I'm going to bless all nations through you, Abraham, as he's speaking of the children of Israel. David is now leading that nation of Israel, and God wants to bless each one. David overflows with generosity. He's given what he's freely received. And when you've freely received and you've allowed God to walk you through the difficulties of vulnerability, and he's given you freedom, you can't help but overflow to others. In fact, there's even a time when you're eager for vulnerability because you see the freedom that it can leave for others. We see in David's life that he was vulnerable but free. And in his vulnerability, it was contagious for others. We see his intimacy that started with true vulnerability. We see the freedom that he had. As we think of the life of David, it reminds us of the life of Jesus, who made himself vulnerable so that you and I could be set free, who for the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross. He set aside, he laid aside, he despised the shame so that you and I could have a life of freedom to be loved and known and to know and love God and others. And when we think about when we understand that Jesus was vulnerable on our behalf, we know that God can set you and me free and that he desires for us to walk and live in freedom and vulnerability.